Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Euramerican National Assembly. I'm your host, Mr. R, and I have Mr. Ed and Mr. Black with me tonight. So, for tonight's topic, what I really wanted to go over, and this was inspired by a number of things, but wanted to go over kind of how to work through what matters and what doesn't. And really more in the context of within the pro-white or white identity or white nationalist movement, whatever you want to call it, that you're a part of. How do you work through that for yourself, especially if you're in a leadership position, because you setting those priorities is going to have a lot of impact on your group. And one of the things that made me think about this was I see a lot of bickering, sort of debating about different topics, and that did make me think to myself, okay, which of these matter to us and why do they matter? And as a leader, as someone who's guiding a group, how much of this is positive and how much of this is negative? How do we draw that line? How do we kind of work through these things? And then also, how do we just, in a world of an incredible number of distractions in the current year, how do you kind of work through what your priorities are and keep those focused and not get distracted by the current thing as it comes along? So that's kind of the lead in, and we'll just have a free ranging discussion from here.
So what were the most pressing kind of issues you thought needed to be addressed?
Well, I think that I guess we can talk about the sort of contentious debates question first to a certain extent. So without getting into the details, there are political topics, there are social topics that I see people really fighting hard on. And we agree on so many things. In my opinion, we agree on all the things that matter. And then I see people putting a lot of energy and a lot of time and honestly kind of breaking unity to a certain extent because they're committing too hard, they're caring too much about some issue of what I would say is probably just temporary relevance. So how do we work through if an issue is actually really important, if we should be putting in energy and effort, and if it matters that someone else in your community disagrees with you? Do you why do I care if someone disagrees with me on this issue? And I think in a lot of cases the answer should be you shouldn't care. How do we kind of work through that?
I know for me personally, I kind of look at issues in the way of A, does it affect my life? And B, can I affect the outcome? If neither of those are in play, I might have an intellectual standing on what I believe or think about it, but it is not something I'm going to put a lot of energy and a fight into, especially with other people if they have a different idea than me. It's not going to affect my life, and I can't affect the outcome of what that thing is, especially if there are things on the other side of the world, things in front of the Supreme Court, things that the president might be doing. I can disagree with it, and I can have my own ideas, but am I going to put a lot of time and effort into that? Maybe if I'm into politics and I want to get him unelected, but like a Supreme Court justice, I can't get them unelected. So, for me, that's kind of where I look at things from a personal point of view.
Yeah, and I guess it depends whether you're talking about how do you set those priorities for yourself, or how do you make or help other people understand what the priorities should be.
Well, I think, for me, those two are heavily intertwined. What my priorities are, and I guess you could say maybe your priorities you should have. Well, I have opinions on pretty much any topic of the day. That is for sure. I try not to talk about many of those opinions within sort of community building efforts, and the reason for that is because I don't see it being a positive. And I think Mr. Black, what you said about can I affect this thing? Can I actually make a change in it? Is one of the major drivers for me. Is if I can't do anything about it, then I shouldn't really worry about it that much. I don't know. That's kind of been my initial stance.
So yeah, I guess there's a couple issues. On the one hand, you said as a leader earlier. So as a leader, to me, what you want to do is you want to bring consensus on some key topics. If you see that consensus, then your job is done. The next thing is, given that you've got a group of people with some sort of consensus on key issues, can you keep them from fighting and killing each other and, breaking apart the social group?
Yeah, so then the question is, how do we work out which is a key issue and which is not a key issue?
To me, the issue of priorities, so when you really sit down and think about what you believe, you should be able to prioritize at least a handful of key ideas that really define what you stand for and which can't be negotiated on. And then everything else can be negotiated from there, I think.
I think, in the literature of ENA, at the Euramerican National Assembly, I think that there's a pretty good sort of summary of the critical topics that everyone has to be on board with. I think that's an important starting point. I guess, if we're in agreement on those topics, and those topics really have to do with who we are, what we want, and how we're going to get there, right? So, as a people, we are people who we're an ethnicity, of European descended peoples living in America, and we have this common heritage and history and all of that, and then we have what we want, which is we want a better life in our future. We want more autonomy. We want more, more prosperity for our group. And then how do we get there? We get there through community building. So anyone who agrees on those things, I feel like we're good to be in our community. But then from what I've seen, people will add on to that you also must believe that, whatever current thing. And I guess, as a leader, one question is, so let's say you have that straight in your mind, how do you communicate that to your group that is in a clear way that helps people stay focused? Even if, so I guess, one, it's difficult just for me to stay focused because I find that I can get drawn to these distractions as well. But then secondarily, now let's say even if I am focused myself, how do I then try to wrangle a group?
The bigger issue or the bigger realities of the situation is, you can influence people, quote unquote, and you can use, if you've got authority, you can use authority to influence people. You can educate people, in other words, help them understand, and you can distract people. Look, a shiny thing, squirrel. Because sometimes people are too OCD, and you got to break their normal pattern of doing things, and that's where distraction comes in. I think my view on, as a leader, what you should try to do is, when you have people coming together, is try to keep them focused and moving on what it is that you're doing. Don't give them too much leeway to do their own thing separate from, we have picnics regularly, and we're just getting together and just having a good time and, maybe talking about whatever we want, and generally we don't see too much conflict between people, and that's good. If there is conflict, then as a leader, I think, you've got to try to assess the situation and try to figure out what it is that you need to do. Do they need to be having this conversation? Is it so contentious that it's just going to result in conflict? And if that's the case, then my view is, let's try to stop this. Try to, again, a distraction and a distraction is not always a negative thing. It means let's try to do something more positive.
Right. With our organization, we built it around white culture, a good space for our people to come together and have white well-being, where we can we can have unfettered discussions with each other about things that we would normally censor ourselves in the general public. But for instance, one thing that I've discovered, I hadn't experienced this myself, is that religion in many of our white positive groups becomes a virtue spiraling nightmare. But in our group, we've set the bound. We have literature that sets the bounds of what this organization is for. It's for white people to come together and experience our culture and our history, and have fellowship and friendship with people who want to do that also. Not to say I haven't had religious discussions with some of the people, and where diversity comes in, we are extremely diverse in our religious affiliations that we have. We have Catholics, Christian identity. We have people practicing Northern European spirituality. We have atheists, but none of us get spun up around the axle and want to fight with one another. Whenever we do have a discussion about it, it's more like, where are you coming from, and what is that? Wow, that's neat. You don't have to agree. You just say, wow, that's really cool. It's interesting to hear your point of view, and you move on. You can do that with most issues.
Yeah, and I think you can, as a leader, as just someone engaged in the community's activities, you have some influence in steering the way things are going. If things get too contentious, then you can try to talk about something else. Some people don't always appreciate that. And the other thing in general, I think, is try to identify what you all have in common. And when problems arise, emphasize those common things that you have.
Yeah, I think bringing it back to, and especially like having even if we could have like a task, like I'm thinking of one particular group, and they do pretty well when they're in person, when they're together, when they're doing something. When there's just chatter, like online between them, it can get bad, and so if people stay focused on a task, and I guess that's kind of what you're saying about like a positive distraction, is, hey, we should really be focusing on this. Let's be working on this right now. You guys can have this discussion, later. I also think that this may be a point in favor of not having as much online interaction. I guess that's one thing that I've seen seems like online interactions are generally negative, or tend towards negativity. And it would be, again, I guess this is why, as a group, the Euramerican National Assembly really emphasizes in-person groups, because it's so much more peaceful and reasonable when people talk to each other in person. But I guess one thing that we should keep in mind, I've thought about this, is if we do have one of these conflicts over some topic that is not part of our core beliefs, we should probably have a strategy for moving people off of it. And I think we do kind of organically, pretty easily so far. As a community, we've done well. But I kind of want to just encourage people in general to think about this in advance. This is going to be a thing that you run into, I think. I think we've probably gotten lucky in terms of having people in the community that are pretty high emotional and social intelligence and are able to manage this stuff. But I do think that leadership has to come into play, because in other groups I've seen that high emotional intelligence is not always there.
Yeah, I think that especially shows up in things possibly in the news cycle, that kind of stuff, that play into red team, blue team. You're either with this group or you're against this group. Sometimes people just want no gray area. You can't have any, nuanced view of how, they got this right, they got that right. They want red team, blue team. Like you said, in our group, I think we have a very high emotional and high intelligence people who they can see nuance. They're well read, and even those that aren't extremely well read are well experienced. So that comes in a big part. So when you get into these red team, blue team fights, if your organization is not about that red team, blue team fight, as a leader, you need to just step in, take the two aside, and explain to them, possibly this isn't the forum for that. You guys can, go somewhere else. You can get together and have that kind of discussion later, especially if people are just having conversation that, even if it just makes other people around them uncomfortable, even if they're in agreement with one another, but if they're, making the situation bad for other people, you can just pull them aside and say, this isn't the forum for that. You guys can have lunch together sometime and, say whatever you want, but this is a function for our group. This isn't just you at your house talking to a buddy.
Yeah, I think that point that if people want to have debate hour, one-on-one is perfectly fine by me, right? Go meet up yourselves. I think that it's probably, we're talking about a National Assembly, which is where we're all going to come together and we're all going to decide on policy and other things that we're all going to push towards. However, I don't think that means that it's a debating club. It's not like every issue that comes up we're going to talk about in the National Assembly. We're going to talk it to death. I don't think that's the goal. If the Irish sort of National Assembly from their independence movement that you've referenced, Mr. Ed, it wasn't that. There were certainly contentious topics in their discussions and debates, but they were generally about things that were relevant to their situation. And they're, once they had some ability to set policy, then obviously there are policy debates that come in. But I don't think that. I agree that we want to make it a norm that we don't talk about things that we don't have to talk about within the sort of community gatherings. But sure, if you want to have a knockdown, drag out debate fight with somebody over whatever, then I'm not going to stop you.
There's another aspect to this, and I would say that some of the dynamics you're talking about are not unique to our people. And my experience with this is in the military. And when you get a bunch of high-energy people together, and you don't give them something to do, then high-energy things start happening. So sometimes, if you're the leader, you have to say, all right, enough of this. No more lollygagging. You, 25 push-ups. You, I want you to go do this. You just have to start pushing people in a more positive direction. And I'm not saying, that's not always the best and most conducive in a non-military environment. But as a leader, you have to recognize that if things are heading south, you better stop them from heading south.
I think that's a good point, too, that when you say high-energy people, it's more than just high energy. It's combative energy in a lot of cases, because you're literally signing up to go against the grain of all of media and the governments and all the messaging that you're getting from the mainstream. You're rejecting that if you're a part of this sort of community. So you have a resistant or combative sort of strain to you, almost certainly, if you're in here, and that's, like you said, that can cause some friction, some problems. And we want, one of our jobs as people that are leading these groups is to minimize that.
I think so. And part of that means when you have an established event, we're going to have an event from time 1 to time 2, that you have some key organized activities in there. You do let people, get used to each other talking, but then they become focused on doing some kind of group activity. We have cube games, we have the cornhole, we have people doing music, and I really want to get us moving into doing some historical stuff. I just haven't quite figured out how we want to present some of this stuff, but I would really like to do it. So give people some time on their own where they can just relax and talk with each other, especially during a meal. And then once they've had a little bit of time, start moving them into some collective activity. So I guess my statement is that events should not be uncontrolled activities. They should exist for a specific purpose, and you're focusing people to make sure that those purposes are met. I'm not saying you're being mean to people. I'm just saying, look, we're coming together as a community. We're not going to let ourselves become something other than that.
Yeah, and if you run into an instance where you have a person who is repeatedly the person causing these kind of things, there comes a point at which, if you're a leader, you need to talk to them and explain to them, here's the ground rules for being invited back to these kind of events. These events aren't about your agenda and what you want to fight with people about. It's about in our case, coming together as a community and enjoying each other's friendship and being able to be ourselves around people who are our people.
So one of the key ideas that has been driving me is this idea of positive culture, positive experience. Our people have been denied that. They're not allowed anymore to have any positive experience of being white, of being Euramerican in any public forum that our opposition controls. And so when we have gatherings, that's what I'm trying to do, is make sure that the entire event is a very positive experience. I mean, yes, there's sometimes going to be people arguing. You got to try to, if that's the case, separate them. I mean, that's what I would do. Because we're not coming together so that they can sit there and argue with each other.
Yeah, if it gets beyond just a discussion and becomes raised voices, definitely you have to step in.
I think your point about there being some structure to events, that being a positive thing, is a good one. We do usually have some loose structure, like you said, and I think as you grow, it'll be easier to have more structure in events. But I do think it probably would have been. It wouldn't have been a bad thing for us to have more of an agenda even early on when there were just a handful of us. So I think that could be a good point, and maybe it's something we should include in like a pamphlet or something about how to have these events, which, just for the audience, this is kind of what we're working through, right? We're trying to figure out how to do this, what are the best practices, and then we're trying to kind of push that out to all of you so you can do this too, and learn from all of our mistakes, or things have gone pretty well, but anything that wasn't optimal or that we could have done better, we want to kind of push that out. So
yeah, on the way here, actually, because we like to learn from other people also, I was listening to Mark Collette, and he was talking about with their organization in Britain, they have a written code of conduct for when they have their gatherings that people will follow, because he's talked about it before. He has some of the same old, what some refer to as the old antique nationalists. They just want to show up, be rabble rousers, and go about their business, of being whatever they are. But that's not what their organization's about, and they will cut people out.
Yeah, I mean, that was my experience with a lot of quote-unquote movement, and, I forget what term you just used, historical nationalists or whatever you want to call them. Any event that they put together was always a complaint fest. And so I didn't think you could turn that into anything positive, which is why, for the most part, I try not to involve myself in those kinds of organizations. What at least I'm trying to do when we have our gatherings is let's keep away from, I mean, there's an old saying, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. So the old style movement was everybody was cursing the darkness. Oh, I hate these people. Oh, I hate those people. Oh, those people are uncontrolled and they're controlling us. Well, we could do the same, but let's not. To me, culture has to be experienced and constantly produced. So in what I'm hoping and trying to make sure happens in our gatherings is that people are talking about the things that are in their family, their lives, that they're very positive and wanting to communicate. Again, so the discussions we're having are very, again, lighting a candle, creating a community that people want to belong to.
Yeah, in today's day and age, if you want darkness, it is just a few clicks away on the internet. You can go fill your head full of all the bad, how terrible the world is, or this group, that group, the other group. As you guys know, I got a new job, and I actually have taken time off of work to come to our community gatherings because it is a bright light. It is a good time. It is our people coming together, and they're, we rarely talk about the bad things that are happening in the world. If they do come up, it's a 30-second conversation about, did you hear about, and then we move on to good, wholesome, better topics about family, about friends, about good food, so yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think this answers sort of one of the big questions, which was it's part of the answer, how do we avoid the distractions? And I think some of the darkness is a distraction. It's real that there are horrific things happening in this country to Euramerican, to white people, every day, and you could just focus on that, but it would lead you nowhere, and it would just it's just darkness that you'd fill your life with. One way to, and if you live on the internet, it's going to be really hard to not have that happen. But that's, I guess, one way to one thing that combats that is getting together in person and having a culture of sort of positivity. And it's not to say that we're always flawless on this.
We're human.
We're all human. We want to go in that direction, and we want to, you have to have a community, and you have to be encouraging each other in the same direction. And I think that is one way that makes it easier to avoid just focusing on doom.
So, stepping back and taking a summary of some of the things we've talked about. So, what do you do when those? On the one hand, you try to avoid it by having structured activities, at least on some regular basis during the time that you have people together,
and defining the things in advance that are common, that you do believe, that are important. Those are all we've all agreed on those in advance, so you've got that all locked down. Yeah. And
then try to keep people, like I said, a positive expression of our culture. We're not going to experience that anywhere else except in these things. So let's do that, because that's what people love being part of it. Why would anybody be a part of a complaint society? And that's what a lot of the movement, quote unquote, has been. It's just a complaint society. And our culture, our knowledge of our history, our ways of thinking and talking, and our literature, these are all things that aren't being talked about, but that should be talked about, I think. These are, that's why I said I'd like to get more explicit historical activities into our events. But just having fun with somebody at a Coupe game or a cornhole game, or watching somebody have music, having a meal with people, and especially during a mealtime when you have mixed audience, people tend to be very circumspect in how they're speaking. It's after that when they start breaking off into little groups and stuff. So, I don't know if you notice, I purposely am being the butterfly and walking around and checking people out. What are they talking about? Do they need to be focused somewhere else? Unfortunately, people don't always do the right thing. And you as a quote-unquote a leader, you have to assume some responsibility for that. Ultimately, if at the end of the day you said, wow, that was a crummy meeting, everybody fought with each other, I guess it gets back to, I mentioned it last time, Jocko Willink's extreme ownership. Ultimately, if you're the leader of that event, if it failed, it's because of you. So if you are running the event, your responsibility is to make sure that your key goals were met. Everybody had a good time. Nobody argued. Whatever that takes. And unfortunately, sometimes there are going to be people that you can't control. If you need to, eject them, pull them aside, do whatever, have a man-to-man conversation with somebody if they're not being adult enough. Again, like I said, you have extreme ownership for everything that happens at your own events.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that that sort of answers the question of how to manage these events, answers to the extent that we can currently answer. I'm sure we'll come up with more details later, but I think that was a good summary of kind of how to manage that. And then, in our daily lives, for me, one thing, has just been to reduce the number of sources of news or potential distractions that come in. I think there could be a temptation for immediacy can kind of drive some of this. Like, you can be more easily distracted if you're always trying to get the thing as fast as possible. Now, if you're doing some sort of news thing, if you like the news feed as an example, you kind of have to stay up on things to be able to do the news feed, or you're behind. But if you're not doing that, I think that it's probably healthy, and it'll help you if you can kind of separate from the feed of information, except for maybe particular times, and again, to limit the vectors that information comes at you. Like, I regret that I know anything about the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, and that's one of many examples. I mean, I feel like there's some current distraction that's happening. I forget.
Hunter Biden, maybe?
Wow, that's
That's an ongoing disaster.
That's just hilarious.
But for instance, when there's a tragic event taking place somewhere in the country, if you're there, you need to have up to the minute, or if you're close or you know somebody that's affected by it, you need to have that up to the minute, data feed. But if you're halfway across the country, you know nobody there, you don't have any kind of interaction with that town or where it's taking place, why do you need to know the very minute somebody puts out a statement or some new fact is known about it? It's literally just a distraction to your life. And, if it's a tragic event, it can be just a constant downer every time you see the next thing come over the wire about how bad things are. But, keep in mind, it's across the country. It's not affecting you and what you're doing. And especially if you're doing something enjoyable, like at a baseball game or with your kids or with your friends, do you really need that tragic distraction coming into you that very minute constantly? Or can you just shut it off, put it away, and enjoy the moment?
Yeah, and so a long time ago I made a decision never to carry a phone, and I don't have one. I don't have a smartphone. And there's some, for one of a better term, OPSEC or operational security reasons not to have one. But it is also a distraction that takes away from community. That, it's almost a joke that if you go to some people's houses, you got 3 or 4 people sitting around staring at their phones. Great, they're individually engaged in something, but as a group, they're not engaged in anything together.
I think it can also kind of sap your energy and creativity to constantly have basically no downtime for your brain. I think that's another important point, is that to get these, to do your best to knock down these distractions a bit, because otherwise they can reduce your effectiveness, I guess would be the summary.
But so this is kind of actually where I thought that the conversation was going from our earlier discussion before we started here. So the most important thing is to understand your own priorities in life. What information do I need? What do I need to know about? And being able to say, I'm going to do something distracting right now. There's a clickbait. Yes, I'm going to click on the clickbait. I know I'm wasting my time, but I do it sometimes too. But when you know your priorities, when you're not doing what is productive, I think.
Yeah, there's kind of a difference sometimes of, you click on the clickbait because it's entertaining.
It is.
As compared to you're clicking on it because you're in this spiral of information that you constantly have to have. Those are two totally different mindsets. One is, I want to laugh for a few minutes about something. It could be something stupid happening in the world, yes. Our president doing some weird stuff yet again, trying to shake hands with the air. Who knows?
Yeah.
But, at the same time, it can be that spiral of, I got to have all the information, I got to have it right now, and just spending hours and hours. It's much different than spending a minute to just get a little laugh in and then go back to, not being distracted from the world that's literally around you as compared to in your computer.
And part of that comes from being able to budget your time, saying during these amounts of time, I'm going to find out what's going on in the world, and then during this time I'm not going to. Try to set aside some specific time for reading the news, but also try to set aside some time for being with your spouse. To me, both of those things are important, and you can't neglect either of them.
I thought that, I thought I was doing a decent job at one point of sort of disconnecting on a regular basis, but then I was out of communication. Like, my phone didn't have service. I was in the mountains, and I realized how much better that was to be totally disconnected for a time. And I'm like, okay, can I get that in my life on a regular basis? I do think that sort of budgeting time, chunks of time, and everything wants all your time, right? That's if you allow anything to metastasize, it will take up everything, every minute of your day. So you do have to manage that. But I like what you said about sort of figuring out, setting out in advance what's important, what matters to you, and then working to budget your time, kind of falling out from that importance level. From what is the most important thing to me, that should be getting the most time.
Yeah.
I earlier this week I had actually heard on some news organizations about how people have what's called FOMO, which is fear of missing out, that you don't know the latest, newest thing that's happening. But at least in my life, like I said, if it doesn't affect me directly and I can't affect the outcome anyway, I don't have FOMO about what Johnny Depp and Heard it. That was like a side circus that I completely ignored. But I would have people all the time asking me if I knew about the case, and it's like, no, I don't. I heard a few funny snippets and saw a meme here and there every now and then, but I really had no idea and no concern. It didn't affect me. I don't know them. I'll never know them. Probably. Who knows? The world's kind of weird that way, but it was nothing I needed to keep up on. There's some other bigger world events that are taking place, which are apparently gone into the red team, blue team category, where I don't need to know what's happening every day over there. I don't live there. I don't know anybody who has lived there. I don't even think I've ever met anybody from that direct region. So I just avoid it altogether. If I happen to see it in passing, that's cool, but I don't go searching for those tidbits of what's happening right now.
Well, one thing that I've seen that, a group I have a lot of personal experience with are preppers, and I will say that one issue they have is hunting for problems, right? They're looking for the thing that's going to come up.
The next thing coming down the pike.
What is going to happen that I have to be prepared for? Now, one of the effects that this has is a lot of them are news junkies, on top of things all the time, and it's like, okay, you have your nuclear preparedness plan, you have your food, you have your water, you have your your communications, you have spare power, you have all the things. It doesn't matter, exactly what's going to happen. It would be good for you to have some advance warning. You don't need to be reading the news 24/7. You'll get a sense that things are getting pretty close if one of the extreme scenarios that you're talking about is about to hit, or it's a scenario which you cannot possibly know in advance, like a major power outage, grid down in an area like the Texas thing that happened a while ago. You're not going to know in advance. You can't possibly know in advance. You might know that it's getting more likely, and here in the Southwest, like we've talked about how it's getting more likely, but that's all you can do. So I think that's a temptation for a lot of people, is to be on top of things because of this feeling that I have to have advance warning. No, you don't.
Right. To go to an extreme, I can guarantee that if we start throwing nuclear missiles at one another, the government is not going to let you know. Yeah. They're going to be worried about getting into a bunker, not telling you what's going on, because they can't protect 300 million people in this country, and it would just fall into chaos. So they would rather get where they need to go. It's just going to happen. and you're not going to know it, but if you survive, you'll have to deal with the repercussions thereafter, but it's not something you're going to get any heads up for, like you said, with a power outage. You can know it. Power outages are possible. They exist in the world. Are you prepared for it or are you not? I personally, like you, have a lot of experience with preppers, and I know a lot of people who have a lot of very advanced stuff put away to take care of that. So you can go to that extreme if you want, or you can just have batteries and a flashlight. But either way, you're prepared for that power outage.
You're as prepared as you're going to be, right? I mean, what are you going to do? You hear some news that convinces you that something's more likely, and then you're going to run out and spend thousands of dollars, on that day. So I think that, avoiding that sort of news hunting, almost paralysis is one thing I've seen, is that people get too much input too quickly, and then they'll end up doing basically nothing productive.
Yeah, I mean, again, for myself, I set aside an hour a day when I'm going to find out what's going on in the world. If nothing else comes up, then I might check out more, but basically I try to set an hour a day, and that's it, and I do a lot of research during that. I check out multiple U.S. and foreign media and such, and try to make sense of what's going on in the world, both domestically and internationally. But after that hour, I mean, I got to go to work, and I'm not carrying a phone, and sometimes at work I can check up on the news, but a lot of times I can't. So, and then in the evening, I have unwind time, and then I budget some specific hours to be with the wife and have fun with her, and I mean, that's my day usually.
Well, I think that actually pretty well covers kind of what I was hoping to cover, which was both from a personal standpoint in terms of what our how to deal with this constantly distracting world that we live in, and also as a leader of community, as an organizer, how do you try to help that community deal with sort of the I think that these debates, the doom sort of talk, those are it's an extension of this same distraction, right? And it's just hitting kind of the community as a whole, and then obviously there's the social aspect on top of that of people using their social intelligence to manage conflict when it comes up. I think that's pretty good in terms of this topic. Anything else we want to go over on this?
No, I think it's been a really good conversation personally.
No, I've liked it.
Okay, well, I think that pretty much wraps it up then. And this is the podcast of the Euramerican National Assembly. I'm Mr. R. I guess I'll sign out. And
Mr. Ed saying goodbye.
Mr. Black, have a good day.
And we'll talk to you in a month.
Bye.